Not I, said the soldier, I just followed orders. And it was my duty to do my job well. Not I, said the leader who ordered the slaughter. I'm saddened it happened, but then war is hell. Not us, said the others who heard of the...
I can say from having spent extensive time in Iraq in the 1990s that its hospitals were like death rows for infants. There were no medical supplies. Birth defects that weren't found in modern medical journals were appearing. Syringes were being reused, and hospital floors were being cleaned with gasoline.
It's one of the crime of the American crime. And if the Bush or Clinton, they know exactly what happened here, they hung themselves by themselves, I thought. And which crime were done by our children to receive this punishment? Only they are Iraqi children, believe me. The most of the children dying because of the cancer, congenital malformation, malnutrition, diarrheal disease. And this is one of the weapon mass destruction against Iraq. This is not only use of chemical weapon, but also this is make everyone is illiterate, sick, and reduce the generation of the future. This one of the mass destruction against Iraq.
A once secular society with advanced schools and progressive positions on women's rights relative to its neighbors, Iraq started to become much more religious. In 1998, Bill Clinton signed the Iraq Liberation Act, which was authored by the neoconservatives of the Project for a New American Century. Quite a few of the PNAC gang are now on MSNBC regularly, celebrating their principle in opposing Trump and never answering for their crimes in Iraq. But that legislation, signed not by Bush, but Bill Clinton, made regime change the law of the land. Even Bernie Sanders supported it.
The hard fact is that so long as Saddam remains in power, he threatens the well-being of his people, the peace of his region, the security of the world. The best way to end that threat, once and for all, is with a new Iraqi government.
George W. Bush and Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld came into power with a mission to overthrow Saddam Hussein. 9/11 was not even hours old when Rumsfeld started pushing to invade and attack Iraq, a nation that had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11. This push to war was aided by powerful media organizations that breathlessly reported on Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. Prominent Democrats and Republicans pushed this myth. Then FBI Director and current Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller also pushed those lies in front of Congress. Former Vice President Joe Biden, who at the time was the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, refused to call a single anti-war witness to the hearings that he conducted on the eve of the invasion of Iraq. And neocons like Paul Wolfowitz promised America that the occupation would pay for itself and go swimmingly.
These are Arabs, 23 million of the most educated people in the Arab world, who are going to welcome us as liberators. And when that message gets out to the whole Arab world, it is going to be powerful counter to Osama bin Laden. The notion that we're going to earn more enemies by going in and getting rid of what every Arab knows is one of the worst tyrants, and they have many governing them, is just nonsense.
This was an elite bipartisan beating of the war drum that culminated with Secretary of State Colin Powell's infamous speech at the United Nations Security Council.
We have first-hand descriptions of biological weapons factories on wheels and on rails. The trucks and train cars are easily moved and are designed to evade detection by inspectors. In a matter of months, they can produce a quantity of biological poison equal to the entire amount that Iraq claimed to have produced in the years prior to the Gulf War. Although Iraq's...
None of that, of course, was true. And 15 years ago this week, the U.S. began its invasion and occupation of Iraq with massive airstrikes across the country in an operation called Shock and Awe. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis were killed throughout the course of the U.S. occupation. Millions were forced to flee their homes and the country. The U.S. backed death squads and paramilitary militias. It conducted massacres in cities like Fallujah, encouraged sectarian battles. Mercenaries, including those from Blackwater, poured into the country, war profiteers, and Iraq became a massive killing field. But the image of Saddam's statue being pulled down in Firdos Square helped the myth that victory was as simple as the neocons promised. And just months into the occupation, George W. Bush declared victory.
Thank you all very much, Admiral Kelly, Captain Card, officers and sailors of the USS Abraham Lincoln, my fellow Americans. Major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed.
Despite this idiotic and sick display by George W. Bush, where he dressed up as a military pilot and stood in front of that mission accomplished banner on the warship, the war in Iraq was just starting. The viceroy that was sent to Iraq to run the Green Zone and the occupation, L. Paul Bremer, he was a neocon who profited off of risk insurance, and he made a series of disastrous and stupid decisions. His de-Baathification edict resulted in 250,000 Iraqi soldiers losing their jobs. It wasn't long before they joined the resistance, and by the end of 2004, there were both Shiite and Sunni uprisings against the United States. It was at this point that large numbers of U.S. soldiers began to die. And in D.C., Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld were whistling past the graveyard and minimizing the anti-U.S. uprisings.
The level of activity that we see today from a military standpoint, I think, will clearly decline. I think they're in the last throes, if you will, of the insurgency.
The highest price for this invasion and occupation was, of course, paid by ordinary Iraqis. And it didn't take long after Saddam Hussein was executed before his trials were even complete for Saddam Hussein's popularity to rise. Many Iraqis hated Saddam, despised him, but they hated what the U.S. had done to their country even more. And that phenomenon continues to this day. In fact, Saddam has never been more popular.
We are in full agreement about how to move forward. So, today, I can report that, as promised, the rest of our troops in Iraq will come home by the end of the year. After nearly 9 years, America's war in Iraq will be over.
Barack Obama, who campaigned as an anti-Iraq war candidate, did pull most U.S. troops out of Iraq, but then he quickly changed course and sent thousands back as fighting intensified along the Iraq-Syria border. What the U.S. started in Iraq ultimately spilled over into Syria, and out of the ashes of a disastrous U.S. policy, ISIS rose. And some of their most sophisticated military operatives and strategists had been Iraqi soldiers fired by Paul Bremer in 2003 and 2004. At least one Iraqi general, a famous one, he was on the deck of cards that the U.S. military created for the kill-capture campaign of high-value targets. He had worked with the U.S. during the Iran-Iraq War. He ended up joining ISIS. And when Obama left office, there were more than 5,000 U.S. troops in Iraq and an expanding U.S. air war.
I had numerous conversations with Sean Hannity at Fox, and Sean Hannity said, you were totally against the war because he was for the war.
Why is your judgment better than...
And that was before the war started. I was against the war. He said, you used to have fights with me because Sean was in favor of the war. And I understand that side also, not very much because we should have never been there. But nobody calls Sean Hannity.
On the campaign trail, Donald Trump railed against the Iraq War, claimed he was always against it, which of course is not true, but he still managed to make some valid points during the campaign, albeit in a very Trump way.
George Bush made a mistake. We can make mistakes, but that one was a beauty. We should have never been in Iraq. We have destabilized the Middle East.
You still think he should be impeached?
I think it's my turn, isn't it?
You do whatever you want. You call it whatever you want. I want to tell you, they lied.
Okay.
They said there were weapons of mass destruction. There were none, and they knew there were none. There were no weapons of mass.
Okay.
Despite all of Trump's rhetoric on the campaign trail, he came into office and proceeded to start ratcheting up the bombing in Iraq and Syria. He loosened rules on killing civilians, and the death tolls skyrocketed. Iraq today remains shattered and violent and dangerous and sectarian, and the U.S. continues to play a destabilizing role on top of the legacy of blood that it already created in Iraq. From the 1960s and the CIA working with Saddam and the Ba'ath Party, to the weapons, intelligence, and support for Saddam during the Iran-Iraq War, to the Gulf War and the destruction of the civilian infrastructure, to the sanctions and the no-fly zone bombings, to the lies about WMDs and the invasion of Iraq, from the stupidity of the neocons before and during the occupation to the massive refugee crisis caused by the war, U.S. policy has been consistent. For the past 55 years, there has been one central truth about the U.S. role in Iraq, and that is that it's been consistently anti-Iraqi people. Since the 1960s, U.S. policy under Democrats and Republicans has been about the interests of Western capitalism, and the flags of American victories have always been planted violently on piles of Iraqi corpses.